Good morning, everyone. My name is Lumini, and welcome to the Switch X lecture on how to choose your best Switch X for endgame. Now, I will go ahead and preface this with this is coming from the perspective of the person who very regularly speedruns Switch X and typically is playing the weapon at the highest level. So, it's something to keep that in mind. One thing for sure is that I'm not telling you to use meta weapons. Um, but this is something for those who want to try and up and improve their game. And not only that, but especially for those who are just wondering, where do I even start with Switch X? Now, originally, this lecture was actually going to be me doing a tier list. However, I felt that doing a tier list for Switch X would not do it justice because, unlike all the other weapons, raw stats are not everything. In fact, let me go ahead and put this in slideshow mode. But yeah, raw stats are not everything because with Switch X, it has the benefit of not only having a very, very diverse range of weapons that it can utilize, but your file type plays an extremely heavy role in that. And the reason for that is because of your different charge times in order to get into the amp state, which is essential for a Switch X user to try and figure out their fastest way to get into it. So that way your damage has an extremely high upkeep. And not only that, but it also unlocks the ability for you to be able to do the zero sum discharge. And so you can latch onto monsters and just always be able to keep up your aggression. But at the same time, the other thing you do have to consider is whether or not you are using a ZSD centric style or a rapid morph centric style. So as a result for this, there isn't necessarily a one rules all for whenever it comes to a raw Switch X as well as an elemental Switch X. That and because Switch X is also kind of a skill dependent, it will depend on how many slots that Switch X might have whenever you would consider using it, because it could make or break a set. Now let's go ahead and go real quickly over the file types. Now first you have your power file, which takes 150 points to amp up. Unfortunately, it is the longest one to build up. And so, as a result, if you don't have a very good opening at the very beginning, or if you don't have very good openings in general, then it's going to be difficult in order to actually get into the amp state for this Switch X. Because once the monster really starts moving around, it'll be extremely hard for you to be able to get that charge. And unlike some of the other file types where it could take they could take much quicker routes to get into the amp state. That's not the case for file. So 150 points to give you an idea on how much work you got to do in order to do that. That is 2 full Heavenward Flurry combos with the addition of an Elemental Discharge just to get it fully amped up. But that being said, your benefit is that you do get yourself a 15% raw multiplier whenever you're in sword mode. So if a monster is especially weak to raw damage in general, then it's definitely something to keep in mind. Now, next one is Elemental File. This one is an extremely popular file type, and for good reason. As you could tell, it is a little over half the amount of power file. So as a result, it's super fast to get into the amp state. Generally, this is about one Heavenward Flurry with a couple extra hits in between. And then bam, you're in there and you can start doing damage immediately. Now for this one, as you can see, this also gives you a 45% elemental multiplier whenever you're in sword mode, which is pretty damn big because Switch Axe actually utilizes element very, very well. Now next is our next popular file type is Exhaust, especially because not only is this also very, very fast to get into your amp state, but the thing about exhaust damage is that you can actually deal KO damage whenever you start applying it to the head. So as a result, this is actually the only Switch Axe that can actually KO monsters, which is pretty damn insane. Because with the ability to KO monsters, let's just pretend you're in a group hunt. You can help out your hammer or hunting horn or charge blade user upkeep the amount of KO pressure that they can do, or you could just give everybody a little bit of a time to relax. But the other thing about the exhaust status is that, especially in Rise, since it was buffed in comparison to previous games, exhaust now has its own staggers whenever you reach the threshold to apply them. So what will end up happening sometimes is that you will first exhaust a monster, then you would reach the damage threshold to actually stagger the monster, then you exhaust stagger him again, which would lead to another damage stagger, and then pray to God. Hopefully by then, you'll be able to unleash a KO on the monster if you've been aiming good enough. The last thing to note is that with Exhaust Vial, your KO capabilities can be increased through Stamina Thief, Slugger, and Feline Slugger. However, there's one thing I have to say is that the KO capabilities is increased very minimally through these skills. You're not going to see a whole lot of value, even with like Slugger 3. But, um, if depending on the monster, like if it has enough HP, then these skills are definitely worth looking into if you wanted to increase your KO capabilities. And now we have Paralysis. Paralysis isn't necessarily a very popular file type because it is the second longest to amp up. But depending on your Switch Axe, usually you're going to be using the Rampage Paralysis Switch Axe for this. It can get very, very strong with your Paralysis procs. But you should remember that whenever it says, like, let's just say, for example, 30 para on Parafile, you are only doing Paralysis applications in sword mode or in your amp state with the little file burst. Anytime you're in axe mode, you are not dealing paralysis. So that's something that you have to keep in mind. So next is poison. Poison, or at least in considering the Nargacuga Switch Axe, is very popular because it is exceptionally easy to get into amp state. You don't even have to think about it because you just play and you're pretty well already there. That being said, just like paralysis, though, poison is only applied whenever you're in sword mode or in the amp state. And then lastly, with dragon, again, this also is one of the easiest files to build up, tying with poison for the fastest. However, you're only dealing dragon whenever you're in sword mode. And the unfortunate thing is that I don't know if there's any multipliers whenever it comes to the dragon files. If I had to make an assumption, then it would probably be similar to element file where it gets a 45% boost to the sword mode. But this one is probably the least popular because not exactly very many monsters are weak to dragon in the first place. And there's better options out there, honestly. So now we need to talk about the amp state. So the amp state is extremely crucial to Switch Axe's kit because this is a humongous DPS bonus. Because every single attack that you do, with the exception of like very, very few attacks, you'll have a file burst that comes after every single attack. Do these file bursts do a lot of damage? No, not necessarily, but with the amount of swings that you're doing, this damage adds up. And not only that, but it also scales pretty alright with raw, but it scales exceptionally with element and status. But also, very importantly, it also turns your elemental discharge attack into the zero sum discharge, unless you unfortunately miss the initiating stab, the monster starts running away, or they start to do something real funky that prevents you from actually grabbing on. But the zero sum discharge also opens up your ability to be able to do the what I like to call the zero sum wyvern blade combo, where immediately after the explosion you just use a wire bug to do the soaring blade back into the monster. Now again with the file burst, they only scale off of your raw attack and your element, and they have a very very low motion value of 10. However, due to that low motion value, this is what allows it to scale very, very well with Element. As a result, I want to say on average, Elemental Switch Axes are approximately 10 to 20% stronger. Fox Invictus definitely has a video on this, where he has the math out with his calculators on how much stronger Element is, especially in comparison to Raw. But generally, if he had to choose between a Raw based Switch X versus a Switch X that has some element on it, and remember, when I say that, I don't mean a power file versus an element file. I'm just talking about whether this Switch X has element or if it does not have element. Uh, The other thing to note though is that these file bursts they do not crit at all. So they're not affected by critical eye, they're not affected by weakness exploit, crit boost or anything, just because, well, they can't crit. So as a result of this, attack boost ends up becoming a lot more important than your usual crit skills. And the other thing to note is that whenever it comes to status, you are able to deal more status applications with it, just because you have that extra file burst giving you that extra oomph. Yes, it's only 70% of your initial value, but if you already have a pretty high value anyways, like let's go back to our 30. I'm trying to do some quick mental math, but at the top of my head, let's just say your paralysis is 30 and your file bursts are also giving in an additional like 21 paralysis for every time that it procs. And this is why Rampage Parrot is so popular. Now, if there isn't a best Switch X, then can every Switch X be good? No, unfortunately not. Some Switch Axes are hot garbage, like the Kezu Cleaver Immortal Serpent, because even though, let's just say the Kezu Cleaver, even though that one's got approximately like 40 initial thunder to go with it, its raw is so low that it just cannot compete at all. But on the other hand, like according to Fox, the Mortal Serpent's at least very easy to craft, just like the Arzur Switch X. So if you're progressing through the game, then these are definitely good choices, but otherwise, they're not. Now, whenever it comes to choosing a Switch X, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, who are you fighting? Because obviously this is an important question, because a Rajang fight is going to be very, very different from a Basil Geese fight. And your choice of Switch Axe matters very, very much. For your more mobile monsters, it's harder to utilize Power File just because you have less hits to get in. Monsters with really, really awful hit zones will probably want you to use element more often. While on the flip side, if a monster has really, really awful elemental zones, but really good raw hit zones, then you're probably going to look at a power file or something kind of weird. But the other thing to consider is that you also have your ramp ups that also take that you have to take into consideration. So anti-aquatic, anti-aerial, anti-wyvern species, these will give you a power boost between 5 to 10%. These can't be ignored. So if you were fighting Mizutsune, you really have the choice between the Narwa Switch Axe and the Xenogre Switch Axe if you wanted to make use of elemental weaknesses, just because the Xenogre Switch Axe has an anti-aquatic, which gives it a large boost. And even Fox's note right here. Sometimes ramp ups can overtake a weapon with fitting monster weakness, and our big example would have to be the Narwa Switch Axe with anti aerial against Barioth. So, yeah, Barioth has a higher weakness to fire. However, the ramp up for anti aerial species actually makes it take over. And as a result of this, you'll even see in mine and Fox's Barioth runs, you'll see that we both opted in for the Narwa Switch Axe just because it's honestly that much stronger, just thanks to the anti-aerial. Now, the second question is, what format do you plan on fighting him with? Granted, if you're looking to fight him casually, then you would just consider yourself in the freestyle format. But otherwise, if you're trying to do something like, let's just say, the TA Wiki rules, Powerfile is usually less favorable just because it's harder to find your openings to actually let yourself build. Now, in freestyle, I will say that Power File is easier to use because you do have your addition of traps, you have your addition of a Palamute or Palico who can either use a status weapon to help lock down your monster, or let's just say for the Palico, for example, they have access to things like the Endemic Lives, they have access to the shock traps, the poison traps. And as a result, yeah, sometimes Power File can be the way to go. But thankfully, though, Fox also reminded me when I was making this that, yeah, freestyle does let you build Power File much, much easier. But that's also true for Elemental File as well. And you can start doing even more damage even faster with Elemental File. So that's something that you really, really have to keep in mind if your goal is to get, like, let's just say, faster times. Now, in your naked hunts, you're just going to have to rely on your Switch Axe's natural state. And so, as a result, you're definitely going to be looking much, much more closely to your Switch Axe's natural raw stats. So, if you need the armor skills to make it work, then you might need to use something else. So, for me personally, my favorite one for naked hunts would have to be the Tigrex Switch Axe, just because the exhaust gives me an AKO to work with, and the exhaust procs also gives me more openings to actually attack the monster with. Now, your next question is, what quest are you doing? So, if the monster has too little HP, then Power File can take too long to amp up. My example for this would have to be the Double Baggy quest, where I initially thought that the Wrath rate, or let's just say the Wrathless Switch Axe, I thought that one was going to be the better one because, first of all, Baggies have very bad hit zones in terms of, like, they're very weak. And not only that, but they also have a pretty big weakness to fire in the first place. However, what I found was that very often, by the time I was done with the first baggie, I still had time on my Switch Axe for the amp state. So by the time I got to the second baggie, it was beginning to run out, and my 2 free openings to amp up were already gone. And as a result, I have to start chasing the monster around whenever they start backpedaling and back hopping, and it's very hard for me to build my momentum back up. As opposed to the Anjanath Switch Axe, which I ended up opting in for. With that one, because it does not take a lot of effort at all to get into the amp state, you just go ham. Very, very easy to get yourself back in there. Now, on the other side, though, if a monster has too much HP, then sometimes you can find yourself in moments where you need to re-amp and you don't have your right conditions. Let's just say, for example, you already used up your Wyvern Ride, and as a result of that, you no longer have a very, very safe opening to get in your Heavenward Flurries in, or your Elemental Discharges to get your Switch X to pop off faster. And the other thing to consider is that if it's a multi-monster quest, then yeah, you're gonna have to choose the best weapon for all weapon or for all monsters if you don't plan on switching in between. Because okay, between you and me, I'm a pretty lazy person, and sometimes I don't have all my weapons made, and so this one affects me more often than not. But also, the quest that you choose, obviously, that's gonna affect the location that you're at. So let's just say, for example, you're at the arena. You have your Rainbow Spirit Bird, which will increase your tech, especially if you're using, let's just say, a Demon Paralysis. And so it is worth considering whether or not you want to use Powerfile because that extra attack, I mean, shit, 15% extra attack on your sword mode, man. Um, that being said, and Fox also brought a good point. You do have some monsters where they're just around tinier monsters, in which case, the nice thing about Switch X and having small monsters on the map is that you can actually take advantage of those small monsters to help you build up your gauge even faster. So monsters like Asharag, where they're getting harassed by the baggies, or Raknakadaki with the Arachnoids, um, you can utilize Power File a lot more easily just because you have those tiny monsters to actually smack and get yourself into the amp state even faster. So as a result, if you're playing on PC and you're using Switch Axe, it's actually detrimental to use the tiny nuke mod or whatever it's called. It's bad to use mods that get rid of small monsters. That's what I'm trying to say. So that's something you have to keep in mind. And then, of course, what are you currently able to make? Not all weapons are made equal, so some are going to demand a lot more out of you in order for them to become functional. Biggest example for this, in my opinion, would have to be the Lucio Atia or whatever the Juratoda Switch X is called. Because on paper, if you're just looking at it, the green sharpness looks pretty shitty. I'm not even gonna lie. The green sharpness looks pretty shitty. I just did not consider using that Switch X at all for a very long time. And then one day I decided to just take a look through my Switch X's, especially whenever I was making this lecture, and I just so happened to have my Sinister Gauntlets on with the extra handicraft. And I saw this thing got into blue sharpness with just one level of handicraft. I'm like, oh shit, we in blue sharpness now? Because the very significant thing is that going from green sharpness to blue sharpness is a jump from a 5% bonus in damage all the way to a 20% bonus in your damage. And with something with 230 raw, that's pretty chunky. And then Fox came out with a run where he fought Magnamalo in the arena using a God Charm for handicraft. And it turns out that that sucker gets the white sharpness even. So as you can tell, depending on how strong your charms are or what you have access to, that will also determine on what you're able to use. Because otherwise, if you don't have Sinister Gauntlets or you're not willing to use Handicraft, then the Lucio Atia is just not for you. But if you're willing to make those sacrifices, then yeah, it can definitely pop off. So here are some generally good switch axes, each by their element. I have them separated by your power file and your elemental file. For your ice, you had the Deora Jana with 190 raw and 41 ice. Now this one's a very, very strong ice switch axe. Because not only do you have your natural white sharpness, but you also have Deora's ramp up skill for Deora Soul, which is pretty much Repeat Offender. And for those of y'all who don't know what Repeat Offender is, it was a generation skill where every single time you attack the monster, your crit rate increases from 10% to 20% to 30% at a max. So this makes it really, really strong with your Rapid Morph style. Now, on the other hand, with the Amber Horfrost, this one's also sporting 190 raw, but with only 29 ice. Now for this one, your ramp up is most likely going to be attack up 4 because that'll boost its raw damage from 190 to 200. It's definitely nowhere near as strong as the Deora Jana. However, if you find that your monster's just moving around way too much, then this is still an extremely good pick. Before Deora came out, this is the one that you wanted to use for your ice element. Now, we go down to your thunder elements. Now, the very neat thing about these two is that both of these switch axes have access to anti whatever species. So it's something that you have to keep in mind in addition to whether or not you want to use power elemental file. You also have to think about, well, shit, is this a water species? If it's aquatic, then use Despot. If it's an aerial species, then use the Abyssal Storm Axe. But sometimes even that decision can still be really hard because if you look at the top 3 Somnicanth runs, the top 3 runs actually use the Narwa Switch Axe. And you would think that, well, shit, why aren't we using Despot? Well, maybe it's because we haven't figured out the strategy for Despot to make it go even faster, but with the Abyssal Storm Axe, because the elemental file just ramps up faster for you, that's kind of why we ended up going for that. That, and you also have the higher amounts of thunder on the Abyssal Storm Axe, which definitely complements the elemental file very well. That being said, both of these switch axes, though, if you wanted to get into white sharpness, you do need to use 2 levels of handicraft, which is something you have to keep in mind. Now, with power file for fire, with the Wrath Blaze Splitter, from what I remember, you only get into white at around 3 to 4 levels of white. So this one's definitely very expensive to get the most out of your sharpness damage. However, even with blue sharpness, it's still an extremely solid pick. Though, if you plan on using the elemental weak point or exploit ramp up, I would probably stay away from it just because you don't have very many monsters actually take value of them. And if they have changing hit zones, like for example, Gasharag with its arms, one moment you'll be able to proc elemental exploit, and then the next moment you won't. I think at the top of my head, the only monster that you could take absolutely full advantage of elemental exploit with is with Great Bag. So take that as you will. But even then, if the monster is weak to raw damage, and the Wrath Blaze Splitter, well, it splits monsters open. And then on the other hand, with your elemental file, with the Gnashing Flaminville, I'm very confident I mispronounced that. But you have a very, very thick 230 raw with a 28 element. Now, the thing about this particular switch X, which also makes it very, very strong, is that you also have access to a level 2 and a level 1 deco slot. So this is actually pretty popular to use for your comfiness because maybe your charm's nowhere near as strong, but this thing's got the natural slots to help you out with that. So we go on to water. Now with water files, I find them to be very, very diverse. With water, you have access to your Parting Slice, which is the Mizutsune Switch X. Now, I don't remember if at the top of my head if it has natural white, but it does have a natural 15% affinity, which is very, very good, especially if you plan on using your rapid morph style. However, if you plan on going more of the ZSD centric style, then your Rampage Slicer is definitely the one you want to look at. Generally, to build those, you would go Sharpness 1, and then your Water Element, and then top it off with your Attack Surge for the extra boost in attack at the cost of your affinity. But at the same time, if you're going to be ZSDing and the bulk of your damage is coming from your ZSD explosions, then crits don't matter, so who gives a shit? On the other hand, with your elemental file, you have your Doombringer Axe, which is the Amadron Switch Axe, as well as your Ludo Asia. again, this is the one that I was talking about where it really depends on how much you have in, in order to build for it. Because with the Doombringer Axe, even though it has significantly less raw than the Ludo Ossia, it does have slots that you can work with, and it's very comfy to use, and a very generous amount of blue too. So you don't have to use handicraft with this. The only thing though is that it does not get into white by any means. With the Ludo Ossia though, this is definitely a Switch X where you need to commit a lot more in order to make it truly strong. And like I was saying earlier, you only need one level of handicraft in order to get into blue sharpness. And then after that, it's 5 levels in order to get into white. But if you somehow are able to do that, then you can truly tap into the strong potential that the Ludo Ossia has. And then lastly, with our power files, or not power files, lastly with our dragon element though, we do have the Abyssal Gale Axe, which is the Ibushi switch axe, as well as the Red Knot Do Not, which is the Valstrax switch axe. Now, I will say that both of these switch axes are very strong, but generally you're going to be seeing the Red Knot Do Not more often because it's just got a very thick bar of white. And yeah, the Abyssal Gale Axe does have a very thick bar of blue, but the Red Knot Do Not is generally the stronger one because, like I said towards the beginning of the lecture, Switch Axe scales a lot better with Element. And as you can see, 37 fucking dragon versus 14 dragon, in which case the elemental file really pops off. But that being said, there are some very niche opportunities for the Abyssal Gale Axe to be used because both of these do have access to your anti-species. But from what I remember, I want to say that like anti-aerial and anti-aquatic are stronger in giving their bonuses versus the anti-wyvern, where it's like a less powerful bonus. So sometimes I remember when I was researching runs for Basil Geese to determine which switch axe to use, there were quite a handful of runs that actually used the Abyssal Gale Axe because of the anti-wyvern species. Or not anti-wyvern, the anti-aerial species. So it's something that you do have to keep in mind. But that being said though, the Red Knot Do Not does have the advantage in which it also is pretty flexible too, because it has a level 2 slot. Now here's some good raw-based switch axes, and again, when I say raw-based, I mean they don't apply any element. They can apply some status, but for the most part, it's just pure raw. Now, the first one is your Rampage Slicer. From what I remember how to build this one, Sharpness 1, non-elemental boost with your attack surge. And for this, it's just pure Herculean raw. Now, your next one, the Nightfall Crescent, and I'm going to include the little note to the side, and the Rex Nasher, they're both very, very popular switch axes because they're very, very easy to build for. Not only is their playstyle very easy because they're very, very fast to charge, but with them being so quick to build for, it just gives you a much easier time. With Nightfall Crescent, if you're using the Rapamorph centric playstyle, then this is definitely the one for you sometimes. Is it the strongest? No, it's not, but it's still a very good switch axe. And as for the Rex Nasher, you also have your benefit of the fact that you deal exhaust damage. So you're able to chain yourself your exhaust chains into your damage staggers, into your KOs, and you can just be the life of the party that way. Now for the next one, the Rampage Slicer S for the or Paralysis file one. This one is also very popular, especially with the lower ranked monsters, because it is just strong. You can lock down a monster and they won't even know what it means to fight back. And even outside of the weaker monsters, Monsters where you wouldn't expect them to have a big paralysis weakness, like let's just say Tobi Kadachi, for example. When I was doing that run, it turned out that you can still get 3 paralyses off of a single Tobi Kadachi, which is nuts, especially for that guy, because he's always fucking moving around. And not only that, but the same can be said for Gas Harag, a monster that's very, very aggressive and also kind of always moving around. You can get him down with 3 paralyses. But for the paralysis switch X, in order to actually really build for it, you need to have sharpness 1, non elemental boost. Because remember, the thing about paralysis files and poison files is that technically they don't have an element. So let's just say, for example, in Sunbreak, non-elemental boost decides to come back, then you would probably see a lot of us putting in non-elemental boost into our switch axes. Oh yeah, and of course, paralysis file for your last ramp up. Now, for Grand Chaos, there are 2 ways you can actually build for it. You can either use Bludgeoner for the 10% boost, or if you have an extremely beefy handicraft charm, then you can actually get this thing up to white sharpness. And with 240 raw and white sharpness, you're doing bonkers damage. That being said, you do have slightly less exhaust, so you can actually expect yourself to find your KOs to be a little bit more delayed than the Rex Nasher. Now for the Griorz Landmaker, this is actually a poison element. Well, when I say poison element, it's poison status with elemental files. This one is the Raytheon one. While it's not the best switch axe by any means, I found it to be a pretty solid switch axe whenever you're just doing your general hunts, or if you just wanted to use something other than Nightfall Crescent. And you also have your added ability that you're actually dealing poison applications on every single hit, as opposed to Nightfall, where it's only sword mode or it's only in your amp state. But the Griorz Landmaker can always apply poison. That being said, I don't expect this to be the strongest thing, especially whenever we go into Master Rank for Sunbreak. However, if poison did scale up like it did in Iceborne, then the Griorz Landmaker can definitely be a pretty solid. It could be a very solid educational switch axe, because with your poison damage, it'll at least allow you to keep on doing damage while being able to observe the monster. Now, for the last 2 raw-based switch axes, we have the Basil Rush Rookslayer, as well as the Teostrus Castle. Unfortunately, Blast is not meta in Rise, but they're still fun to use. And if you're on a multi-monster quest, then I would say that's even more power to you. But that being said, if you wanted a power element file, I would go Basil Rush Rookslayer. And then if you wanted your elemental file, then I would go Teostrus Castle. Out of the 2, the Teostrus Castle has the higher blast procs. And as a result of this, if you just wanted to meme around with your friends, then get you and 3 other buddies to use the Teostrus Castle and just see the monster just literally blow up. That being said, though, a big reason why these 2 aren't used to too much, aside from the fact that element just scales better than status and just plain raw damage, is the fact that the more HP a monster has, the less powerful Blast is in general. Because as you begin dealing your actual Blast procs and the explosions start happening, your status requirement is just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger, eventually to where if you weren't very good with actually hitting your weak zones, then you're going to be finding that Blast is not doing too much for you. Now, with elemental switch axes being about 10 to 20% stronger than your non-elemental switch axes, why the hell would you even bother with them? Well, for one, you do have your case of your awful elemental hit zones. Looking at you, Rock Nakadaki. But sometimes some lockdowns or even semi lockdowns are only possible through the use of status. For my example, whenever I was doing my Ecnosm hunt, I found out that I could actually lock down the monster just by smacking it with exhaust vials. So instead of just trying to go ZSD centric or just even using an anti-aerial species with Narwhal, what I ended up doing is that I used the Tigrex Switch X. I smacked the monster a couple times and get my first exhaust dagger. And then with that first exhaust dagger, I was able to attack the monster a couple more times to proc the damage stagger. And then it looped back to the exhaust stagger, which looped back into the damage stagger, and then eventually I did get my KO. And depending on your positioning, you can really bully some monsters into a wall. And I do mean it. If you're able to get yourself between you and then the monster and then the wall, you can just shove them into a corner. And if you have buddies to do this with, you can really shove a monster into a corner. And of course, like I was saying earlier, some monsters are very weak to paralysis. And I'm not going to re-say my example. And then lastly, Blast can be nice on multi-monster quests, just because in general, with monsters in multi-monster quests, they have a tendency to have less HP. And then lastly, you got your Rapid Morph style. Now, for your Switch Axe skills priority, whenever you are making a Switch Axe set, these are, in my opinion, your priority for the skills that you need to build for. The very, very first thing that you want to be looking at is Rapid Morph. Because not only does this increase your normal damage output by giving you extra damage on your switch attacks, this also just makes all your morphing attacks much faster, which allows you to do even more damage in your Rapid Morph combo. And not only that, but with the extra speed in your morphs, it also is a good mobility option too. So let's just say, for example, you decided that you wanted to spam dodge roll and you just needed a little extra distance in order to get out of the way of an attack. Start morphing. That morph will get you out of the way faster than you can think. But not only that, but there's also a tech with Soaring Wyvern Blade where if you time the morph the moment the explosion actually happens, you can actually increase the damage of that explosion. So as a result of this, if you're really, really clever or if you're really good with timing these things out, then you can see yourself boosting your damage even more. Now, the next skill priority is your attack boost. Um, Attack boost for Switch Axe is much more important than crit boost, especially because your files do not crit. And so as a result, you just want to be able to increase everything across the board. Now, in my opinion, the next one would have to be Protective Polish, just because Switch Axe uses a lot of sharpness. It's ungodly with how much sharpness this thing uses. So being able to have infinite sharpness for 30 to 90 seconds is extremely invaluable. But if I have to give a recommendation as for how much Protective Polish, I would say your minimum would have to be level 2. Because with level 1, it does not give you a whole lot of room to attack. Because typically what would happen, you would sharpen, and then you would have to catch back up to the monster. And catching back up to the monster can eat up sometimes 5 to 10 seconds. Then the monster roars, which takes like another 2 to 3 seconds, especially because you have to dodge the roar or you have to switch charger through the roar. And then now you're already down. Okay, let me think. I said minimum 5 seconds to catch up, another 5 seconds to dodge the roar. You're looking at only 20 seconds left to actually start doing things. And if it's at the very start of the fight, then you haven't even begun to get into your amp state. So by the time you're in your amp state, you're almost done with your 30 seconds. And that's the most crucial part that you need your infinite sharpness at, is during your ZSDs, because it's the ZSDs themselves that eat up a shitload of sharpness. So that's why I say at a minimum, have at least 2 for a full minute, but if you are really wanting to push that sharpness, then have Protective Polish 3 for a full minute and a half. Now, the next skill priority, of course, is your elemental attack up, just because files do scale very, very well with your element, especially with those little tiny file bursts. And then next up, weakness exploit. I mean, yes, you're doing ZSDs, but at the same time, you're still doing other hits here and there. And not only that, but the stabs for the ZSD, they still crit. And so just having a little extra oomph in your damage here and there is never wrong. And not only that, but for some of the switch X's that are very popular to use, like the Rex Nasher, the Anjanath switch X, at the top of my head, they both have negative affinity, so the weakness exploit will at least negate that negative affinity. And then lastly, Power Prolonger. Now, this one's priority can go up and down depending on the type of switch X you're using, because with, let's just say you're using Power File, then yeah, you're going to want that shit to last, because it already took you forever to actually get there in the first place. And then with Elemental File and all the other files where it's just very, very fast to get into it, the extra seconds is still the difference between being able to latch onto a monster to continue on your lockdown, or it's the difference between running out and now you're trying to charge, but that Raytheon has decided that she wanted to go on a marathon run for a charity event. So that's something to keep in mind. That being said, as for a sweet spot for Power Prolonger, even having just level 1 is a big boost to your damage. But I will say that you can get level 2 for free by either using the Royal Ludroth legs, in which case using those will give you a level 3 slot, from what I remember. Or you can use the Juratotus chest, in which case not only does it give you 2 points into Power Prolonger, but it also gives you 3 slots to put in your elemental gems, or grinder if you wanted to. And it also gives you evade distance for your extra mobility. Now for your essential skills for your ZSD style, because like I said earlier, there are 2 main styles for Switch X. You have your ZSD style and your Rapid Morph style. So for ZSD, obviously Rapid Morph for sure, because yes, you aren't necessarily always using your morph attacks. However, the morph attack is still just really essential for your mobility. And not only that, but whenever it comes to coming out of your Soaring Wyvern Blade, you can use the morph attack to quickly get out of the recoil from it. Now, for attack boost, of course, files can crit, but they scale with your raw. For your elemental boost, your files have a 1.0 modifier with your elemental output, so you really have no reason not to boost your element. And then again, Protective Polish, and then Weakness Exploit. Now, for some situational skills for ZSD style. Now, Critical Eye and Crit Boost. Now, for these two, this is really dependent on A, if you have the space for it, and then B, how much of a rapid morph that you might find yourself doing, and then C, how much natural crit that particular Switch X has. I mean, after all, you're still doing rapid morphs here and there. And so as a result, this will help you get some extra damage in here and there. However, again, it does not scale with any sort of file attack, so that's something that you really have to keep in mind. So if you find yourself doing ZSD 90% of the time, then you might want to steer away from Critical Eye or Crit Boost. If anything, these are at best these are luxury skills at best. That being said, though, it does pair very, very nicely with Deora Jana, because Deora Jana essentially has 30% affinity. Amber Horfrost has a natural 20% affinity, and then Nightfall Crescent has a natural 40% affinity. So as a result, let's just say you just put in 2 levels of Crit Eye, and then you put in at least 1 to 2 levels. 1 to 2 levels of crit boost, and bam, got yourself extra damage. Now with Agitator is also really, really good because since it actually adds extra raw, that actually scales with all of your files, making your switch X even stronger. So if I had to rearrange this list, granted, none of the things in this particular list are in any sort of order, but I would have to say Agitator would have to be the top one to choose for your situational skills. But again, adds extra raw for all your attacks to get a bonus from. And just for your rapid morph combos or just your random hits here and there, the extra crit can be nice, especially in negating your negative affinity. Now, next is status up. This is only if you have the space for it. And I guess in that status up, I'm also going to kind of loosely include KO because KO is technically a status. But if you have the space for it, then go ahead and put it. But with the big nerf to status for set building in general, I would not generally recommend it just because a level 2 slot is just so precious and you would be better off using it for something else. But if you have the space for it, then sure, why not? It's not a bad idea. And then with exhaust up, you would normally think, yeah, let's just max out the exhaust. But there is actually such thing as too much exhaust. And the reason why there's such thing as too much exhaust is that sometimes you need the monster to do something in order to be able to get a good opening in. Let's just say, for example, with Raytheon, you need her to go into the air, do a tail flip, anything, and so that way you can dunk her. Well, sometimes if you're doing a ZSD in anticipation to dunk Raytheon, those first couple of stabs will end up exhausting her before she actually has a chance to actually take flight. And as a result of that, you'll end up canceling out so many monster actions that would have given you an even larger bonus than what the exhaust would have given you. And so there is a happy medium, and I can't tell you what that happy medium is because it really depends on what your goal is, especially for the fight. But that being said, if you decide to add in the extra exhaust, you do have a slightly easier time at getting an extra KO, so something to keep in mind. Again, more situational skills, handicraft. That depends from switch X to switch X. I mean, some switch X's have natural white, so you don't need to have handicraft all the time. But Fox's recommendation is that generally you don't need a thick bar of white. You just need like a tiny little sliver, just because you're going to be using protective polish anyways. And so what he also recommends is that if it's not possible or if it costs more than 3 levels of handicraft, generally just go ahead and use blue sharpness. And that's because at that point you are also sacrificing space for other essential skills. And then for your next one, you have razor sharp. And like I put in, sometimes you don't need protective polish in a couple hunts, and depending on your switch X, you don't need protective polish. Big example for this that I have at the top of my head would be utilizing razor sharp with the Valstrax switch X. Yeah, you do have your chunky bits of white, but it doesn't last forever. And once you're out of white, you're in red. And sometimes like an extra level of razor sharp can help you to make sure that you can finish the hunt before you actually do reach red. And then for Slugger, this is very, very situational. Because generally by the time you get that second KO, if you had actually just aimed your shots a lot better, then you would have killed the monster anyways. But if a monster has just enough HP, sometimes that second KO can end up saving you a lot of heartache. And the biggest example of this that I could think of would have to be against Kushala, where a second KO, because it's got enough HP that a second KO is actually valuable, this will save you a lot of heartache. And then lastly, the last one would have to be Wirebug Whisperer. Generally, you're never going to see this However, just with one level of Wirebug Whisper to hold on to your third Wirebug for longer can ensure that you can do your ZSD into the switch charger loop a lot longer. Because one strategy that you can use that I've used I think in my Rathalos freestyle hunt is I would ZSD onto the monster, explosion happens, soaring wyvern blade into or back to the monster, get one hit in so that way I can do another attack instead of doing the full recoil from soaring wyvern blade, switch charger, ZSD back in which case hopefully one of my wire bugs is at least 70% charged. ZSD back, explosion, soaring wyvern blade, hit, switch charge, ZSD, and you just keep that loop going for as long as you can. And having that third wire bug for longer means that you can do this for longer too. Now, of course, ZSD style is not the only style. You also have Rapid Morph style. It's less used because it's slightly less powerful than ZSD style. However, for certain fights, you're going to want to use Rapid Morph style more often. My biggest example for this would have to be my fight against Ignazim using the Rex Nasher, where it turned out that Rapid Morph style was just the way to go. Granted, I didn't build for that, but if I did, it'd probably look something like this, where you would prioritize all your crit skills first, because you're not as worried about your file procs or your ZSD explosions, because, well, you're going to be doing less of that. You're just going to be doing your typical Rapid Morph combo. So generally your crit skills, and then whenever it comes to Sharpness Management, you can either go Razor Sharp, you can go Master's Touch, or you can even go Protective Polish. And then of course afterwards your attack boost, because I mean extra attack's just delicious. And then after that, Agitator, and then your Element, Status, Exhaust. Now with Dragonheart is something that you should consider only for your raw switch axes, or if your switch axe has Dragon Element. Because something that some people do forget is that Dragon Element deletes your status applications. And so if you're even using just the Valstrax arms for the 2 levels of crit, or 2 levels of weakness exploit, and then the 1 level 2 slot, you have to keep in mind that you need to stay above 50% HP. Otherwise, you just accidentally neuter your damage from tanking too much damage. So, like for example, if you use Dragonheart with the Nightfall Crescent, because I mean that seems like a good idea, get yourself your extra 10% damage boost, and then your extra damage boost from your attack, and then your extra damage boost from your crit boost, and then you think you have that poison as a little cherry on top. Well, because you're using Dragonheart as your main strategy for the extra damage, at 80% HP or less, no more poison. But if Dragonheart is your strategy, then your ZSD style is going to be the way that you ensure that you get into it, as well as ensure that you stay in it as well. Because you still, I mean, obviously, you still take damage whenever you're latched onto a monster. And as a result of this, it's a pretty safe way to ensure that you're able to do the max amount of damage while making sure that you quickly get into Dragonheart 2. Now, the types of switch axes that you would use this with would have to be pure raw, exhaust file, because for some reason exhaust is the only one that does not lose its exhaust procs. I mean, I don't know, just it is what it is. And your Dragon Element switch axes. And again, like I said, you can make an argument for Night Crescent if you don't care about the poison. Now, I'm going to go ahead and end this lecture. A special thanks to Strawberry Shortcakes, because you're always interested in knowing why I choose what I choose, as well as like why this particular switch axe, why did I do this thing. And for all your questions, thank you, because it's due to those questions and you asking why I use particular things, that's actually what inspired this this lecture. And also, special thanks to Fox Invictus. This guy is an absolute badass with Switch X. And not only that, but he's just a wealth of information. So make sure to check his channel, especially if you want more Switch X information, especially on the mathematical side of things. He is a very knowledgeable person, and he can generally always point you in the right direction as to what he recommends you to use. And of course, as always, special thanks to my wife, Kat, for always standing by my side and always constantly encouraging me to do my best and to always believe in myself. And without her, none of this would be possible. That's a certainty. So to you, my love, if you end up watching this video, again, thank you very much and I love you. All right. And of course, if you want access to the weapon attack table, then make sure to check out this Google link. I'll be providing the lecture in the PowerPoint, so I'll make sure to upload this to my Google Drive to where y'all guys can see it and take a look. And of course, Fox's channel right there. All right. Well, with that, I hope y'all guys have a wonderful day today, and I hope this lecture helped out. I'll see you next time.